Hello interwebs, it's your gal Jessie Gender here with another Star Trek novel review, because if we're going to be nerds, we might as well go the extra mile and be the nerdiest of nerds and read and review Star Trek tie-in novels, because I love those things. So for today's video, I am actually going to be reviewing the latest Star Trek novel release called The Unsettling Stars by one Alan Dean Foster. Now, this book is particularly notable for several reasons. The first of which is that it is the first ever Kelvin Timeline novel ever to be released. And for those of you who don't know, the Kelvin Timeline is the timeline created in Star Trek 2009, JJ Abrams film, with Chris Pine as Kirk, Zachary Quinto as Spock, and Carl Urban as McCoy, and kind of has its own continuity separate from the original continuity, primetime, and all those things. I'm sure most of you out there already know that, but just to catch everyone up with the rest of the class. So it's really fascinating that we're finally getting a novel set in that universe. And this book is also notable because it was actually scheduled to be released and was written 10 years ago. Yes, this book was actually supposed to come out right after Star Trek 2009, or at least a few months or a year or so after that film, but was actually put on the back burner at the time because for some reason, as I believe Pocketbook star Simon & Schuster said at the time, that they didn't want to interfere with what the Kelvin Timelines were doing. They didn't want to cannibalize what JJ Abrams or Alex Kurtzman or Robert Orci were maybe going to do with the story of that universe going forward, which actually was kind of weird because there was actually a bunch of Star Trek comics that were being released at that time in the Kelvin universe, as well as a video game that came out around the same time as Star Trek Into Darkness. It wasn't great, but it was sort of a story in the Kelvin universe as well. So it was a bit strange that we didn't get these novels, but maybe there was something that was lining up, or there's some backdoor deals, things like that. It may be a story we may never get the full details of, just because I'm sure it had to do with many deals, and people just want to protect their ability to work with the company, because a lot of these authors are still working with Simon & Schuster today. But regardless, this book is finally coming out 10 years after the fact. This one's coming out first. The second of the three that were initially delayed is coming out later this year by David McMore, Beautiful Than Death. And then the third was actually already released by Christopher L. Bennett in a book called Ex Machina that was reworked so that it fit in the prime timeline with the original Star Trek crew instead of being in the Kelvin timeline crew. So we probably won't be seeing that book anytime because it's basically already been released, just sort of massaged into a newer form. But the third and final reason that this book is notable is that it's written by Alan Dean Foster. And for many of you, if you are a huge Star Trek nerd, that name may sound familiar to a lot of you in that Alan Dean Foster actually has had a history, and a very important history, with Star Trek before this point. He was the one that actually wrote the Star Trek log books way back in the 1970s, which were books that did adaptations, novelizations of the Star Trek The Animated Series episodes that had like three adaptations, novelizations, what's the right word? Basically written adaptations of the Star Trek animated episodes, and like 3 per book. And they were, like I said, released as the log books, and because I'm a huge nerd, I happen to have quite a few of those books in my possession. Obviously, I treat them well. But yes, they're actually very important books, as they were some of the first Star Trek books released. They weren't the first, I don't believe, but they were the ones that sort of kept the hype going and really kind of built the popularity with Star Trek tie-in novels. I mean, without those books, we wouldn't probably have the tie-in novels that we have today. Even more so, Alan Dean Foster actually helped create the story for Star Trek The Motion Picture. Now, there's a whole other story that I could get into in a whole nother video about sort of his contributions to that movie and how he felt slighted because he actually didn't get story credit on it, or I believe he didn't get the right, like he didn't have first credit. I need to go back and look at the specifics, but basically I remember there being a sort of issue between Alan Dean Foster and Gene Roddenberry at the time, because Alan Dean Foster didn't feel like he got as much credit as he deserved on the final product, considering how much he contributed to that movie's story. But again, that's a story for another day. Let's focus on this. So it is kind of cool that he actually is coming back into the fold with this brand new novel. Now, with all that history out of the way, what did I actually think about this book, Star Trek The Unsettling Stars? Well, first and foremost, I'm going to talk about my positives with this book up front, and then I'm going to get into a little bit of the negatives. So, first and foremost, this book follows Captain Kirk after the events of Star Trek 2009, where he's basically the youngest captain that Star Trek has ever had. He's still relatively untested, very young for a captain, because he's sort of been plopped into this position based on circumstances that happened in Star Trek 2009, basically dealing with Nero, and Starfleet not really believing that he can possibly lead the Enterprise at such a young age and with such a young crew. So this book basically follows him on his shakedown cruise, his first mission out into the stars, where he just basically takes the Enterprise out for a little while and brings it right back, and basically Starfleet evaluates how everything went. But of course, because this is a novel, he gets sidetracked at one point by a situation with two races fighting each other, and eventually has to come and render aid to basically a refugee race running from another race. And kind of gets mired in a political situation with what do you do with some refugees. And what I particularly loved about this novel, without getting into deep spoilers, is that it used a lot of what was particular about the Kelvin timeline and actually added it into the characterization of these characters and helped it motivate some of their plot and decisions. Like, in particular, that I'm thinking of off the top of my head, Spock, being a refugee now that Vulcan was destroyed in Star Trek 2009, feels a great affinity for the refugees that they are dealing with in this story, the Paranoians. Paranoids? Don't know exactly how to say the name of the species because, you know, it's a book. So I really like that it tied those threads in. And then the other element that kind of came in as well in terms of the characterizations of these versions of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy is Kirk basically kind of feeling like he may not be ready to be the captain at this point in time. Like, he may make the wrong decision in dealing with this race. And then a couple other really nice things that happened throughout this novel that kind of felt like they were particular to the Kelvin timeline is there's a couple visual stamps that you notice peppered throughout the book. Like, for example, at one point when the crew goes down to a planet, they come across a huge, like, building-sized monster that's attacking them and the alien refugees who are trying to settle on the planet. And it's a really fun action sequence that feels right out of Star Trek 2009, where, if you remember, there's that Cloverfield-type monster that chases Captain Kirk on the moon of Vulcan in that movie. So that felt very particular to the Kelvin timeline. It felt like it evoked that sort of more kinetic, action-heavy, big feel that this universe has over the original Prime timeline. And so I kind of enjoyed those nice, subtle touches of what made this a Kelvin novel in particular. However, this does start to get me into some of my negatives with the novel here, just a little bit. And that kind of goes with this sort of alien mystery that is going on with these refugees. And I kind of don't want to spoil too much about the alien because, and here's my problem, the mystery with the alien I kind of got after about a chapter or two. Like, about, a third of the way through the book, I understood basically what the issue with these aliens was and what the problem with them was going to be moving forward. And to give a little hint of it, you basically get this idea that these aliens are super friendly, that they are easily, they're very easy to be very effacious and sort of bow down and help everyone else. They're like, oh, Captain Kirk, you're the best person. You're so smart. You're so wonderful. They basically feed into people's egos and mean it very sincerely. But then also at the same time, they pick things up very quickly. Like, for example, and again, I'm trying to remain somewhat spoiler-free here, they are able to learn human language in about a day. And they're able to pick up a lot of things about how the Enterprise works in a day, having never met any of these systems or ever met a human before this point, and yet they're so quickly able to pick this up. And the novel spends a lot of time repeating that point over and over and over and over again, and building the scale a little bit, showing you like, oh, here's how it gets a little bit bigger. Here's how it gets a little bit bigger. Here's how it gets a little bit bigger. And kind of building the growing tension, but it never feels like it actually hits a tipping point where you sort of see where the problem is. It's like, I know where it's going, but it never hits that point. And then the novel has a bit of a time jump in the middle, and it kind of skips over to where it's a problem. And again, I'm trying to remain spoiler-free as possible because I do think it's an interesting story being built here, but it does get a little bit repetitious, and I do kind of get the idea of where it's going pretty quickly. So pacing really was one of the bigger issues with the book overall. Also, speaking of pacing, there's a lot of scenes in this book where there's sort of action going on or an event taking place, and the characters kind of stand around just talking about it for a very long time. And it kind of feels weird that there'll be like a scene of a big action sequence of the monster attacking people, or a big diplomatic dinner event where these characters like Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are supposed to be taking place in the events going on, but then they kind of sidebar and talk for pages and pages about some of the implications of the things going on. Now, that would make sense in sort of maybe the original series or something like that, but feels a bit off here, especially in the Kelvin timeline where things are a bit faster paced, but even more so when it's sort of like, this is an event that is currently happening. Why are all the characters somehow now off to the side having long conversations instead of actually dealing with the problem going on? And it just sort of felt weird and sort of took away from the forward momentum of the book by just having these constant moments where things would be going on and then the characters just sit and talk about it, even if there were lives in danger at that exact moment. So honestly, just overall pacing in this book was just a serious issue, unfortunately. That being said, where it does go is super fascinating, and when it actually finally gets there, there's some really interesting socio-political commentary that's being made, and here's where I'll sort of start getting into a little bit of spoilers. It's a bit of a commentary on what the Kelvin timeline as a whole actually means for the Star Trek universe. Basically, this idea of if there are people who can do something better than you can, if it's faster, if it's smarter, if it's crazier, then what's the point of having the old fogies, like the people who don't do things as well as they do? Basically, these aliens learn how to run the Enterprise better, how to make faster warp drive, how to fight better, how to deal with problems and deal with political issues much faster than anyone on the Enterprise can, and so everyone on the Enterprise starts feeling depressed and feeling like they're a waste, which honestly feels somewhat like a commentary of what the Kelvin movies were towards the Star Trek franchise. The Kelvin movies are faster, they were more engaging, they were these big budget spectacle films, and it made us wonder, like, what was the point of having the prime timeline characters, like the sort of more slower Star Trek stories that we were all used to and all grew up and loved. And I liked that this book kind of had a pseudo-meditary commentary on that, but I just felt like it took way too long to get to that point, and then by the time that we got to that point, it felt like it just wrapped it up very quickly, and honestly, in my opinion, a little bit of a cheesy way, especially towards the end. It felt like a storyline that came right out of Star Trek, the original series, like the sort of like awkwardly cheesy resolutions to things, like people getting, the story basically goes like people get sprayed with mist in their face and they become like walking zombies to these people and don't have any problem with anything. It felt like a very like kind of cheesy Star Trek, the original series storyline, or something out of the animated series, which would fit with Alan Dean Foster's writing style, with basically how he's written Star Trek before then, but didn't really in the resolution feel like it fit within the Kelvin timeline. So it's this interesting tension that comes out of here, because it seems like it's a meta commentary on what the Kelvin timeline is to the Star Trek franchise as a whole, and yet as the novel gets towards its end, kind of regresses into what the original series was, as opposed to what made the Kelvin timelines unique, in that they were much more kinetic, faster paced, had slightly different versions of these characters who, in the novel, as the novel progresses, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy kind of just fall into the Kirk, Spock, and McCoy that we love from the original series, as opposed to the Kirk, Spock, and McCoy that we love from the Kelvin timeline movies. So it's this sort of interesting jumble where I think Alan Dean Foster was trying to have this meta commentary, but also like basically have his cake and eat it too. Be able to try and say something about the Kelvin timeline movies, but then also kind of have his original series novel as well, without really delving into what makes the Kelvin timeline unique. However, one final positive that I will give this book is that it did have a really cool tie-in to Star Trek the Motion Picture that actually helped resolve the story in the end of the book. And I won't spoil it here because I don't want to give away how they reuse an element of Star Trek the Motion Picture in the final parts of this book, but it is a fun little Easter egg and tie-in that sort of shows you that this is a different universe than what we got in the prime timeline. It was just a fun little Easter egg for everyone who's a big Star Trek fan out there, but not one that detracts from the story as a whole by saying like, hey, look, it's an Easter egg. It's something that still works organically, but is a fun little thing for you to pick up if you know Star Trek the Motion Picture. And so I will say, to wrap out my review as a whole, I really enjoyed this novel. I thought there was a lot of fun bits. There was a lot of things that I thought, especially towards the beginning of the novel, that really made this feel like a Kelvin Timeline book as opposed to a timeline book from the original series. But as it progressed, it kind of lost a little bit of that luster towards the end and felt like it wrapped out too quickly and lost a little bit of what made the Kelvin Timeline and this book at the start unique, and kind of just became another Star Trek story, which, don't get me wrong, I love. I love reading my Star Trek stories. It's why I read so many of them. But given the amount of time and build-up, and maybe it's a bit unfair because when he wrote it, he didn't expect this to be like 10 years down the line that it would be released, and he expected there would probably be more Kelvin Timeline books. But given that this is the first Kelvin Timeline book that we're getting after 10 years, it kind of feels a little sad that it doesn't feel a little bit more unique to the Kelvin Timeline as a whole. And ultimately kind of left me a little bit disappointed, fairly or not fairly. It might be a little bit unfair towards the book, basically considering its history, but just having read it, I kind of have to be honest and say I was a little bit disappointed in it in the end, but still found it to be a very solid Star Trek book overall. Well, that's my thoughts for all of you. I'd love to hear what you thought about this book if you read it, or if you're going to read it, down in the comments. Also, because this is one of my Star Trek literature reviews, these videos don't do as well as a lot of my other videos on this channel, so it really, really honestly would mean a lot to me if you hit like and if you comment, and if you're not subscribed, to subscribe to my channel from this video, just because it helps boost these videos and helps get them out there and helps me continue to be able to do more literature Star Trek reviews on this channel, because I like doing them, but there is a point where when videos don't do as well, I kind of need to stop doing them because they hurt my channel's growth a little bit, which is frustrating and a bit annoying, and I hate the algorithm. But if I want to keep doing this and grow my channel, it's a little bit of, unfortunately, the game that I have to play. So please, if you do like these reviews of Star Trek novels, please, 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 if you can, hit the like button, leave a comment, and if you're not subscribed, please subscribe to the video from this video in particular. But regardless of all that, whether you like or subscribe or anything like that, also don't forget that you can help make this channel even better if you go and give over on my Patreon page. Every little bit helps me pay the bills, especially right now, given all the craziness going on in the world. It really means a lot to me to have a little bit more financial stability through Patreon, so if you can give there, that really means a lot. But as always, regardless if you like, subscribe, comment, or give to my Patreon, I'm just glad that you stopped by and that you enjoyed this video. I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. And special thanks to my commander level and above Patreons, especially right now: Eli Bergmas, Stefan Schuhart, Boyd and Mary Beth Earl, Wellington Marcus, Lal Lindley, Marika Kuyechin, Munir Amlani, and Mystic the Monakit.